Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Seams with your narrator, Jay, from the Drunks on the Pond podcast. If this is your first time here, then welcome. The purpose of this series is to highlight some of the older players in baseball that you may not have known about or history has forgotten. In this new installation of the series, I'll be talking about the life of one Rube Waddell, the man who lived such an eccentric life but was unfortunately haunted by the bottle. One of the greatest pitchers of his time when he wasn't busy going fishing or just disappearing for months at a time. Please allow me to introduce our protagonist for the evening. Before we get into it, if you enjoy these stories and would like more, then please make sure to subscribe, leave a thumbs up, and comment who you would love to hear about. Baseball has had plenty of storied careers, and I'm going to do my absolute best to keep these coming. Now let's get into the story. George Edward Waddell was born on October 13th of 1876 in Bradford, Pennsylvania. He grew up in western Pennsylvania in a town called Prospect. Growing up, he was described as a different sort of child, which would tell any person that clearly something was off. I say this because at the age of 3, he wandered over to a local fire station and proceeded to stay there for several days. He's 3. Wouldn't have happened nowadays. He threw rocks at birds while working on his family's plot of land and even did some work in mining and drilling sites as a young man. Either this was the hardest working child in America, or it might be the first documented baseball player to have attention deficit disorder and make it into the Baseball Hall of Fame nonetheless. Let's keep going. The nickname Rube has different origins. One being that it meant just being a big, fresh kid. Simple enough. The other being that it means being a farm boy or a hick. Also makes sense. Either way, his nickname was Rube. After moving to Prospect, Rube looked for people to play baseball with, but unfortunately, because of the years throwing rocks at birds, other kids would say he would hurt their hands throwing the ball and would just refuse to play with them. His big break would come in 1895 when he was 19. He received an offer from Butler baseball team. Waddell was extremely talented, but struggled to stay dedicated to the game of baseball. He would often show up late or lose focus and goof around entertaining children during games. Not in that type of way. Like I said, he may have had attention deficit disorder, so obviously he was just a kid at heart. Let's keep going. There were even times where he would leave in the middle of games to go fishing. See where I'm coming from? The following season, he was offered a job to play for a team in Franklin, PA. The team was not very successful, so he ultimately decided to return home to Prospect to work. In April of 1897, he was offered a contract to play for the Pittsburgh Pirates under manager Patsy Donovan. Patsy invited Rube out to breakfast before practice, but was released before practice even began. Nobody knows why he was released, but you can make an educated guess on what happened. Rube returned to Butler, but found out he had an offer from another college to forget about education and strictly play baseball. Every kid's dream, honestly. The school was called Valant College, which was located close to Butler. The school offered him $1 a game and free chewing tobacco. To purely show you how insane that is, Juan Soto, who recently signed a 15-year, $765 million contract, makes $210,000 a day based on playing a full season. Back to the story. During the season, Rube played for Valant, and he played relatively well. They only lost 1 game. Unfortunately, when other teams found out about him, they refused to play against him. His time at Valant ended after 1 season, and he moved back to Butler. In 1897, he signed his first professional contract in the amount of $500 with the Louisville Colonels, a team in the National League. He played well for Louisville for a couple months, but manager Fred Clark couldn't deal with Rube's attitude and actions. Are you really surprised? Fred traded him to Detroit. Detroit signed him in 1898 for the season, and Rube excelled despite Detroit being a below-average team. Unfortunately, Rube got himself into trouble once again for playing baseball outside of the Tigers, whether playing for non-professional teams or just regular sandlot squads. He went to Canada to play ball, but ended up returning back to Butler shortly after. Are you surprised? The next 13 years of Rube's career would lead him being traded more than 10 times from team to team. Back to Louisville, to Columbus Grand Rapids, back to Louisville again, then back to Pittsburgh. And then he was borrowed by Connie Mack, manager of Milwaukee, and then returned to Pittsburgh a month later. Mind you, this was all in a span of a year or two. 24 months in that many trades. In May of 1901, he was traded to the now Chicago Cubs, but then the Chicago Athletics for good money. Once again, because of his behavior, he was suspended for the last month of the season. Now, I would like to take a moment to go back a little more in depth so you can fully understand why some things were happening. As eccentric as Rube was, he also had a very dark secret. He was a terrible alcoholic. His drinking led to a lot of bad decisions in his life, which probably contributed to a lot of the trades. As a left-handed pitcher who are always known as southpaws, and an alcoholic, he earned himself the nickname the Southpaw. He was as dominant a pitcher that we'd ever seen at that time, but being as erratic as he was, there was just never a guarantee. Let's jump back in. In June of 1902, the start of Rube's domination of baseball would begin as he would rejoin Connie Mack in Philadelphia, joining the Athletics. From 1902 to 1908, he led the league in strikeouts and only one season where he didn't have more than 200. In 1905, he had his greatest season, winning the pitching Triple Crown. He won 27 games, struck out 287 men, and he had an earned run average of 1.48. It's just insanity. It was domination on an entirely different level. The Athletics would proceed to make the World Series, but because Rube had been roughhousing with a teammate and suffered a shoulder injury, missed the rest of the season. Now, I mentioned earlier in the story about Rube possibly having attention deficit disorder, and after talking about part of his career, I would like to go more in depth on why I believe so. Rube was so easily distracted during games that opposing teams would hold up puppies and shiny things to distract them. It always worked. If he heard or saw a fire engine driving by, he would immediately take off and follow it to wherever it was going. He would leave in the middle of games to go fishing. During Rube's time in Milwaukee, Connie Mack made a deal with him that if he pitched both games of a doubleheader, he'd give him 3 days off just to go fishing. He did. And he went. He lost track of how many times he'd been married. Obviously, alcoholism played a big part in his life, and unfortunately led to his time in Philadelphia ending after a fight with a teammate. After his time in Philadelphia had ended, he went to St. Louis to finish off his major league career. To keep him on a straight path, the owner of the Browns hired Rube to be a hunter during the offseason just to stay busy. In his first season, he actually set an American League record with 16 strikeouts in a game. Unfortunately, after Rube's career began to slow down and his talent began to decline. It led to his release from St. Louis in 1910. In the minor leagues, he pitched for cities such as Newark, New Jersey, Virginia, Minnesota, Minneapolis. So, obviously, he was finishing up. In 1912, Rube began to show signs of tuberculosis, which could have been from a river flood in Kentucky. He stood in an icy river for hours, trying to pile sandbags along an embankment just to stop the rushing water. He unfortunately ended up in a sanitarium in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio because his sister was down that way and he just wanted to be close to family. Can't hate the man for that. On April 1st, 1914, Rube passed away at the age of 37. In 1946, he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Rube Waddell was a man who had such amazing talent despite not being dedicated to the game of baseball. His lifestyle was one that would obviously not be approved of by today's standards, but at that time, there was no one there to stop him. Rube was baseball's greatest drawing card in the first decade of the century despite his issues, and still holds a spot among the greatest pitchers of all time. Thank you so very much for tuning into this episode of Behind the Seams on Rube Waddell. I had a blast making this because this was a man who would be considered an anomaly in baseball. His life was short-lived, but his memory will continue to live on in baseball lore. If you have anyone in mind that you want to see, make sure to comment down below. My name is Jay, and I will see you all in the next episode. Cheers.